On the 3rd of December 1854, British Redcoats fought rebelling gold miners in Australia. The Battle of the Eureka Stockade was the bloody finale between industrial and political unrest amongst the mining community and the British authorities, which became a defining moment in Australian history. OK, I know that some of my Australian viewers, and that's about 10% of you, will be like, yeah, I know this one. But when I was recently chatting to some of my patrons from the UK and a couple from Canada, they were more like, what on earth is that all about? So, seeing as today is the 29th of November, and the Southern Cross flag of the rebellion was raised on the 29th of November 1854, and the Battle of Eureka Stockade was then fought on the 3rd of December, I thought that today is as good a time as any to share this story from history. I hope you enjoy it. Australia in 1851 was still very much the land at the far side of the world. Whilst Captain James Cook had claimed it for Great Britain in 1770, most of it was unexplored by Europeans. In fact, it would be another decade before Robert O'Hara Burke and William John Wills crossed Australia from north to south. And it was only just over 60 years since the first fleet containing British convicts had arrived at Botany Bay. And indeed, they would continue to arrive until 1868. By 1850, the population stood at somewhere around 300,000, with well over half in New South Wales, 60,000 in the colony of South Australia, and about 75,000 in the new colony of Victoria. And then, in 1851, everything changed. Gold was discovered. People flocked to the goldfields in New South Wales and Victoria from around the world to make their fortunes, and that sudden influx changed the structure of Australian society. In 4 short years, between 1851 and 1855, Victoria's population rose from 75,000 to 290,000. But the good times, where gold nuggets could almost be picked off the floor, soon disappeared. As mines had to be sunk, the capital outlay for miners increased. Moreover, the massive rise in the number of miners meant that the gold cake was being sliced ever thinner. In 1852, 5,000 miners in Victoria were producing about 5 ounces of gold per head. Just 2 years later, in 1854, nearly 100,000 miners, 20 times more, were producing just 1.5 ounce per head. Far from living the life of kings, many miners, or diggers as they were called, were living a subsistence life. And just to add to their sense of hardship and shattered dreams, the government introduced a licence fee at a whopping 30 shillings, that's just over £1, a month, on all miners. And it really didn't help matters that some of those licences were administered by corrupt officials and were enforced by brutal policing, and more of that in a little while. In 1853, the goldfields began to see increasingly large protest meetings, very much like the Chartist protests back in Britain only a few years beforehand. Indeed, many of the miners had been involved in movements in Europe like the Chartists, the Young Ireland Uprising, and similar nationalist political groups elsewhere. They presented their grievances to the inaugural governor of Victoria Colony, Charles Hotham. More scholarly than military, he had previously travelled through America with writer Washington Irving, and many wondered why he had been appointed to his role. In fact, sometimes he asked himself the same question. Having introduced the licence fee, he now questioned both its level and also why the diggers had no representation in the colony's legislative council. Not surprisingly, the vested interests in the colony, in other words the old settler families and landowners who dominated the legislature, were enjoying this new cash flow from the licences and weren't keen to see diggers anywhere near the corridors of power. They lectured the governor on his need to stand up to these ruffians and revolutionaries on the goldfields. Facing increasing hostility from diggers and the Legislative Council, Hotham had enough and offered his resignation in late 1852. However, he remained in post for nearly 18 months whilst a successor was appointed. His eventual successor was a man cut from a very different cloth. Captain Sir Charles Hotham was a Royal Navy veteran who'd served in the West Africa Squadron. Arriving in June 1854, he was prepared to use military-style discipline to keep the new colony in order. something he was encouraged to do by the resident Gold Commissioner, Robert Reid. Reid was convinced that the unrest had little to do with the licence fee, and a lot more to do with revolutionary agitators arriving from Europe, and in particular the Irish, for whom he had a special dislike. With the governor's backing, Reid set out to ensure that all diggers paid the licence fee, and to that effect, the police conducted what were described as digger hunts, sweeping through the goldfields, chasing miners and asking to see their licence. They even demanded that miners below ground came back up to the surface for inspection, and anyone who resisted or objected was liable to receive an arbitrary beating. The eye-watering licence fee, the blatant corruption amongst licence issuers, the brutal police tactics, and the lack of representation, not to mention the tough economics of gold mining, created a volatile bonfire that was just waiting for a match. And that match was provided by a drunken Scot and a former convict. The drunken Scot was a miner by the name of James Scobie. The ex-convict was the owner of the Eureka Hotel at the gold prospecting town of Ballarat, about 65 miles west of Melbourne. On the night of the 6th of October 1854, Scobie had been drinking with a fellow digger, Jimmy Martin. Well oiled, they then tried to gain entry into the Eureka Hotel for another drink. The hotel was shut, and the owner, James Bentley, told them to clear off. 35-year-old Bentley had been transported from Liverpool to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, back in 1844. After exchanging obscenities, as the two drunks wandered off, they were suddenly set on by a gang, and Scobie beaten to death. Bentley, his wife and two others were charged with Scobie's murder. They appeared in front of a three-man government board of inquiry, consisting of none other than arch-foe of the diggers, Robert Reid, Reid's assistant, and the local police magistrate, one James Dewis. Talk on the goldfield was that Dewis was taking bribes from Bentley in return for his hotel licence. So with a board consisting of those three men, it might not come as much of a surprise to discover that all four accused were acquitted. Miners from the area were outraged. On the 17th of October 1854, about 5,000 people attended a public meeting to discuss the case. Just to add to the volatile atmosphere, it was held outside Bentley's Eureka Hotel. Whilst moderates managed to steer the meeting to launch an appeal to raise a reward to apprehend Scobie's killers, some of the crowd broke away and set fire to Bentley's establishment. The ex-convict managed to escape out of the back door and rode like a maniac to the safety of the army camp on the edge of the township. Meanwhile, at the front of the burning hotel, Commissioner Reid was powerless to act, as a police officer had dropped the Riot Act in the confusion before it could be read. Consequently, with no Riot Act read out, the authorities had to stand aside. The following day, however, Reid had his revenge, as he rode into town with an armed police escort and arrested three men for setting fire to the hotel, although apparently arrested at random, which did nothing to defuse the situation. Governor Hotham now ordered a retrial of Bentley, and he and two male accomplices were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 3 years' labour on the roads. That might have calmed things down, but Sir Charles refused to address the underlying problem of the cost of the licence fee and the digger hunts by the police. Moreover, Commissioner Reid still had those arrested miners in his custody on the flimsiest of evidence. If you're enjoying this story, then please feed the beast that is the YouTube algorithm by giving me a like, post a comment, or indeed share with a friend. The more of these sort of actions by you, the more people YouTube will show this video to. Thanks. On the 11th of November, the diggers formed the Ballarat Reform League to petition the governor for change and for the release of their fellow miners. The leadership of the league was split on how to proceed. The moderate wing, seeking a peaceful resolution, included the editor of the local newspaper, the Diggers' Advocate, a man called George Black, and an Irishman, Peter Lalor. Born in 1827, Lalor came from a political family back in Ireland. His father was a backer of Home Rule and had been elected to the Parliament in London, whilst one of his older brothers had been killed in an attack on a police station in Tipperary during the Young Ireland Uprising of 1849. Peter and another brother had emigrated to Australia, arriving in 1852. After initially working as a railway constructor, he had moved to the goldfields to find his fortune, with which to buy a farm for himself and his fiancée. Others within the League advocated more direct action. Amongst these radicals were Richard Thomas Kennedy, a friend of the murdered Scobie, Raffaello Carboni, an Italian revolutionary who'd fought in Garibaldi's army, and Frederick Wern, a bombastic Prussian who talked a good fight and had brought his place on the committee by offering a £100 loan to the cause. On the 27th of November, the League sent a delegation once more to petition Governor Hotham. They demanded the release of the men accused of burning down the hotel. However, the naval officer took offence at being dictated to by what he classed as social inferiors, and he dismissed their entreaties. Whilst they were still negotiating, a detachment numbering about 150 men from the 40th Regiment of Foot were ordered to march to Ballarat. The 40th Regiment had originally been raised in Nova Scotia in 1717. They had participated in the failed attempt by the British to capture Buenos Aires from Spain in 1806, and were one of only 3 regiments to serve the entire 6 years of the Peninsular War. Having fought in the First Anglo-Afghan War in the early 1840s, they now found themselves on garrison duty in Australia. At Ballarat, they were to join a detachment from the 12th Regiment of Foot, who were already camped outside the town, along with the local police. The 12th would later become the Suffolk Regiment, now part of the Royal Anglian Regiment. The arriving British troops on the 28th of November were met by crowds of miners, initially hurling oaths, but then stones. And in a melee around the supply wagons, a drummer boy, James Egan, was shot in the leg. The following day, the 29th of November 1854, the diggers and their supporters held another mass meeting outside the town, at Bakery Hill. And it was here that Charles Ross unfurled a flag that he had designed for their cause, depicting the Southern Cross on a navy background. Peter Lalor, now elected their leader, or commander-in-chief as some of them called him, led the diggers in swearing an oath. "We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties." The defiant miners then proceeded to burn their licences. By 5 p.m, 500 diggers had converged around the Southern Cross flag. Many had been drinking, and in their newly found martial spirit, fired shots into the air. Things were getting serious. That evening, the League sent a final delegation, headed by Carboni, to try and avert the coming crisis. Aware that further reinforcements from the 12th and 40th Regiments, along with some naval detachments and artillery, were on the move from Melbourne under Major General Sir Robert Nicoll, Reid refused to compromise. Having sent the delegates away empty-handed, he now decided to play a waiting game and let the diggers sober up overnight. It was a brilliant miscalculation, because the following morning, far from having that morning after the night before sort of feeling, the diggers were even more defiant than ever, and their ranks had swollen to 800 men. So now, to show who was boss, Reid ordered the police to conduct a licence hunt through the mining camps. I mean, talk about pouring petrol on the flames. The enraged miners who had gathered around that Southern Cross flag at the Eureka goldfield now began building a stockade from wooden pit props, branches and logs. Their crude fortification was about an acre in size. Inside, some men performed military drills, whilst a blacksmith manufactured pike heads. Outside, digging trenches were converted into rifle pits. Through the next day, Friday the 1st of December, there was an uneasy standoff between the two sides. By the Saturday, many of the miners' initial enthusiasm was wearing off. Bored that nothing was happening, hundreds of the defenders went off to see their families, or to enjoy their usual Saturday night entertainment in the hotels and bars in the town. After all, they argued, the British authorities wouldn't attack on a Sunday, the Sabbath. Would they? By midnight, barely 150 diggers were left in the stockade. But the Sabbath was exactly the day the authorities decided to attack. In the early morning on Sunday the 3rd of December, 270 police and soldiers moved into position. Mounted infantry and police were placed to protect the flanks of the storming party. That party, consisting of 40 men drawn from both the 12th and 40th Regiments of Foot under Captain Henry Wise, would assault the stockade, while the rest of the troops remained in reserve. There are conflicting reports as to who fired first. Lalor recalled being woken up by sounds of shooting and shouts of "Stand to, the Redcoats are coming." Other miners recalled some American compatriots shooting first. At 200 yards, Captain Wise formed his men into two firing lines. Armed with the new mini rifle, which had an effective range of 300 yards, they fired a devastating volley towards Eureka Stockade. The Italian, Carboni, later said that any digger whose head was above the barricade had it shot off in that opening volley from the British troops. The 26-year-old Wise now ordered his men forward into a hail of bullets coming from the stockade. With about 100 yards to go, he was hit in both legs. Nevertheless, his men pressed forward and stormed the barricade. Inside the Eureka Stockade, it was chaos, miners arming themselves with pikes, taking on British redcoats advancing with bayonets. Charles Ross fell trying to protect his Southern Cross. Trooper John King from County Mayo, Ireland, climbed the flagpole and cut it down, and as it landed below, cheering soldiers stabbed at it with their bayonets. In the confusion, Peter Lalor was found by a digger lying semi-conscious under the debris of the barricade with the shattered arm. Making sure the coast was clear, the digger dragged him away. The Battle of the Eureka Stockade lasted 15 minutes. 22 diggers and 2 soldiers were killed immediately in the action, whilst 20 diggers and 13 troopers were injured. 4 of those soldiers would die of their injuries, including Captain Wise. It could well be that other injured miners pulled themselves clear of the carnage, only to die of their injuries in the surrounding bush. 114 miners, or rebels as they were termed by the authorities, were arrested, but in the end only 14 were taken to Melbourne to stand trial. Major General Nicholl finally arrived to find that the rebellion was over and the town was actually operating almost as normal. Shops were open for business, diggers working their mines, and his troops were greeted, well, with civility if not enthusiasm. Unlike Commissioner Reid, the 68-year-old general was willing to take a more conciliatory approach. Walking into the mining camps without a guard, he engaged the diggers in conversation and listened to what they had to say. It went a long way to normalising relations. So impressed was Nichols that he convinced Governor Hotham to lift martial law after just 3 days. The trial of the 14 arrested rebels began at the end of February 1855. The first 2 accused were found not guilty, and it set a tone for the rest of the trials. Carboni appeared, accused of picking up a pike and threatening the soldiers in the battle, but statements from the police and soldiers contradicted each other, and when he was accused of burning his licence, he promptly produced his valid licence. His case was quite literally laughed out of court. Sir Charles Hotham and Robert Reid were lampooned in the press. By the 27th of March, all the remaining prisoners had been released. The collapse of the trials resulted in an amnesty for those rebels still in hiding, including Peter Lalor. The diggers collected £1,000 as a gift to thank him for his leadership, and with that money, he bought a farm and married his fiancée. The following year, he was elected to the Legislative Council of Victoria, where he would become the Speaker. He died in 1889. Carboni would travel around the world and finally return to Italy, where he died in Rome in the 1870s. Governor Hotham called for a Goldfields Commission of Inquiry on the 7th of December 1854, and it reported in the following March. Acting on its recommendations, he removed the licence fee and replaced it with a £1 a year miner's right. He also introduced an export duty on gold bullion that brought in far more cash than the old miner's licence ever had. Sir Charles Hotham died 12 months after the Eureka Rebellion, while still Governor of Victoria, in December 1855. The Eureka Stockade Rebellion has become one of the defining moments in Australian history. Former leader of the Australian Labor Party and High Court judge, Doc Everett, said, "Australian democracy was born at Eureka." And yet, it's also little known elsewhere in the world. As I said earlier, some of my patrons, and they love history, said, "What's that all about?" Well, hopefully they, and some of you, now know. It was the moment when British Redcoats fought in Australia at the Battle of Eureka Stockade, 3rd of December, 1854. There are so many interesting stories from history, and I've got plenty more in the pipeline, including for all my Aussie viewers, Albert Jacka. But in the meantime, why not watch another one of my videos that's popping up on the screen, well, about now. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, or even better, become a patron. There's a link below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.